grad at Nichols College. And today we'll talk about the housing bubble in China and Canada. So first, a little introduction. Owning a house, like in historical term, is kind of gives a sense of security to people, and also creates some assets, and hopefully that asset will like grow in the future, so we can finance retirement or buy a new house. But in the 70s in the U.S., it started with the prime mortgages that went until 2000, early 2000. They started with subprime mortgages, which created inflation on the housing market. Influenced the price of house went up significantly, which a lot of people were putting money into it. And securitization also was forced people to do that. So for this project, we use a definition of Joseph Stiglitz for a bubble. So if the reason that the price is high today is only because investors believe that the selling price will be high tomorrow. So the U.S. housing bubble was described as a Ponzi scheme by Paul Krugman. During this, people were risking their saving, hoping to make a lot of money in the future. It was described as the American dream. A lot of immigrants that came to the country, and minorities, were buying houses that they couldn't afford because they feared of being left out of the so-called party. And also, like Iman Minsky described had the three principles in this financial hypothesis. Hedge, which is when people can repay the principal and the interest of the house. The speculative, when they can pay the interest but not the principal. And the Ponzi, when people cannot pay anything. And we saw those three stages during the crisis. At first, the edge dominated, so everything was fine. The economy was at equilibrium. But as we got closer to 2008, when the bubble burst, we went through speculative and ended up with Ponzi. So that's when things went south, went pretty bad.
So I took the part on China. Within China, I focused specifically on Macau. So just a little bit of background on China. #1 gross exporter in the world, with 40% of their GDP coming from like manufacturing, things like factories, and other like products that come to the U.S. Since the market crash in the U.S. in 2008, GDP is up 143%. So the country grows at like astronomical rates. Comparatively, the U.S. is only up 26% since the crash. There's been arguments that it's been inflated artificially through the things of like through the use of ghost cities and things like that. Example of like ghost cities are Ordos, Kangbashi. I'm sorry if I butchered that, but it's basically cities that were built and nobody inhabits it, or it's like operating at very low percentages as to what it can handle. So China has tried to implement policy to try and like keep growth levels stable and try and deflate the bubble. For example, in Hong Kong, they've been closing a tax loophole, which was basically first-time home buyers got a certain tax credit, and investors would use people who didn't own a house to purchase it in order to receive that credit. And also in the province of Hangzhou, they banned single adults from buying apartments who already had homes, so try and keep the city as like a primary residence city rather than a vacation home city. Wages in China overall have been growing steadily with the economy, so it keeps like the real price level somewhat in check. And interest rates, things like mortgages and loans, the rates have steadily been dropping since 1999. They spiked in 2008, obviously because of the U.S. financial crisis. They peaked at about 8%, but right now they're holding steady right around 4.25%. So one thing I looked into was China's Lewis turning point. So basically, in China's case, this is the movement, or rather the depletion of the labor force in the agricultural sector to move to the manufacturing sector. So the factories that China's like known for rely on the cheap labor. So a paper by the IMF, a study by the IMF, sorry, projected labor shortages between 2020 and 2025 in China. So basically, if this happened, their economic model would fail. Right now, they rely heavily on foreign investment. So if the factories weren't able to have cheap labor, then that model would fail. And they'd have to redefine their entire economy on public consumption. So now moving into Macau. As you may know, Macau is just a gambling hub. It's like one of the largest gambling cities in the world. The 21st century legislature paved ways for US companies like MGM Grand and Venetian to set up casinos over there. Gambling and tourism account for 50% of the country's GDP. So, for example, in October 2013, $4.57 billion was the revenue just for that month. In tourism, it has increased 1,500% over the past, since 1999, so over the past almost 20 years. One problem with gambling is it's a hub for money laundering. So I looked into the research of Professor Godino he's a law professor at the University of Macau, and he cited that money laundering is a big driver for these casinos, because basically you could take in money from proceeds like drug sales or extortion, things like that, take it into the casino, gamble with it, and then take it out as legal money. So he cited the use of junkets, which are like a money smuggling agency type thing, and that's what's used to funnel money into the casinos and make it legal. So Macau real estate, it's very closely tied to the GDP of the city and gambling revenues. So when gambling does well, the housing prices do well. So as you can see from this graph, like in 2008, 2009, housing prices plummeted, I guess, just like the rest of the world. But since then, per year, they grow between like 20 to 30%, which is just, for such a fixed asset, is very, very volatile. Over the last 3 years, wages have basically stagnated. So I think this adds to the bubble, because when people can't pay a mortgage, because the price of the mortgage is going up, then they'll eventually have to default and things like that, which will eventually cause it to crash. So looking at Hyman Minsky, he says financial crisis is a systemic issue, and what I believe is that the casinos are the cause of this systemic issue. So the casino system basically drives the Macau economy. So with such a volatile industry, based on people having the ability to spend money, when times are bad, the housing market will be even worse. It will just crash. There'll be nothing to drive these casinos, which ultimately drives the housing crisis.
And I focus more on the Canadian housing bubble, more specifically in Vancouver and Toronto. So the Canadian economy is closely tied to the US as one of the biggest trade partners with the US. And so obviously in 2008, when the economy in the US crashed, Canada suffered also. But from 2001 to 2005, so in the beginning of the crisis in the US, ownership in Canada didn't grow by that much, only by 2%. And now, in 2017, 66.5% of the people of Canada own their home, and homeownership accounted for 1/3 of the population's assets. And at the same time, the household debt to disposable income reached 169.9% in 2010. In 2017, which was a 30% increase from 2007. So this is a graph of Canada homeownership rate. So as we can see, like it followed close to the US in 2008. It was really high, and went down after the crisis because people had to sell their house, and went back up. And the next graph is the household debt to disposable income, which, as you can see, in 2007 was relatively low compared to what it is today. So the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation is comparable to the HUD, the Housing Urban Development. It's responsible for mortgage loan insurance, MBS, housing policy and programs, and housing research. So they were created by the Canada's Bank, and they issue insurance for high ratio mortgages. So what high ratio mortgages is a mortgage that has a down payment under 25%, and the premiums for those insurance are between 0.65% and 2.75%. So this insurance obviously decreased the risk for the lenders, which allows them to make riskier loans, riskier mortgages. So foreign investment. In Toronto and Vancouver recently implemented a 15% tax on foreign buyers. Because in Vancouver the houses that cost on average reached 1.9 million in 2017, and Toronto went up by 33% to up to $1 million. So obviously for the middle class it's not helpful, most people cannot afford those houses. And prior to the tax in Vancouver they were 13% of foreign buyers, and now it's 4%. And Toronto saw a similar decrease. And the purpose of the tax is also to kind of regulate the inflation of the houses prices, and to increase the quality of life of middle class, because as a result they had